The American Cornerstone Institute is proud to bring you our latest podcast, heard on West Exec. Through interviews with former executive branch appointees, heard on West Exec listeners will get an inside view of how the executive branch works, learn about the different roles that are needed to make the executive branch a success, and hear stories from folks that have witnessed history in the White House and our federal agencies. Episodes will be posted weekly, and you won't want to miss one. So head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts and hit that subscribe button.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Heard on West Exec. This is Evelyn Lim from the American Cornerstone Institute, and I am so excited to have Irv Dennis, a colleague of mine at ACI, on the show. We were actually also colleagues at HUD, and that is what we are going to talk about today. So, Irv Dennis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. These podcasts are a lot of fun, and we're getting a lot of good information out there. So thank you for having me today.
Well, absolutely. You have been a host of several of our podcasts, and so I think our listeners know a little bit about you. But why don't we start with your background in the private sector?
Yeah, so my background in the private sector was all with one firm. It was with Ernst and Young. I spent close to 38 years with them. Ernst and Young was a large accounting and auditing and consulting firm. I was in the audit practice. I'm a CPA by trade, and I was the audit partner, which is the coordinating audit partner from some large global accounts like McDonald's, Cardinal Health, Abbott Labs, and I knew financial excellence, and that's one of the reasons that the government was interested in me coming into the executive branch and working with Dr. Carson at HUD, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. HUD's financials were a bit of a mess, and I had a vision with my background in auditing and understanding large, complex entities on how to remediate a lot of their issues. So that is my background. I had no government experience at all. I didn't understand Washington. But I love the experience, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, and so you had obviously had a very successful career at Ernst and Young, working on these major global clients, and you were heavily recruited to come work at HUD. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just kind of given that background, when you came into the agency, what were your, first impressions from a fiscal discipline standpoint of HUD?
Yeah, Evelyn, that's a great question, and I talk about this quite often when I talk to students in my guest lecturing. One of the biggest differences, I was surprised at how poor the financial situation was at HUD from a fiscal responsibility. And when you think about audited financial statements, they could not be audited for 10 years. There were so many material weaknesses in their financial infrastructure and significant deficiencies. And there was over 2,600 audit recommendations that go back 10 years. And the government has a lot of financial reporting outside the financial statements to help track for government or for grant monies to be accountable to the taxpayer. HUD was in compliance with none of them. And the surprise on that from me and my background was you can't get away with that in the private sector. Large corporations, not-for-profits, schools, churches, they all have to have accountability for their dollars, or else they would not have the support of their stakeholders. If you have all kinds of material weaknesses in your financials and you cannot rely on the numbers that your auditors are auditing, stakeholders will pull out. Investors won't invest. Vendors will not do business with you. Employees would not stick around because they may not get paid. So what was happening at HUD and its financial infrastructure cannot happen in the private sector. And I write about this in my book that it's interesting that the government holds the public sector's more accountable than it does it sells, because the SEC will not let a public company trade its stock if you can't get an audit opinion. So to me, that was one of the biggest surprises that I observed very quickly when I came into the executive branch.
And you mentioned your book briefly. I just want to let our listeners know about this, because really, if you're interested in this podcast, then you would be interested in the book you wrote, Irv, Transforming a Federal Agency, Management Lessons from HUD's Financial Reconstruction. And there's a foreword here from Dr. Ben Carson. And it really outlines a little bit about your background, but really what you did and the steps you took to transform HUD from really having this. I mean, you mentioned not having a clean audit, but that was happening for many, many years. Material weaknesses and significant deficiencies. This is so interesting to me. You mentioned this would never happen in the private sector. What were the consequences of that in the public sector?
Yeah, in the public sector, being companies, the SEC would not allow you to trade your stock, right? And like I mentioned, investors would pull out. The entities wouldn't survive. You need audited financials so people that rely on them can rely on them. In the executive branch, HUD was the only cabinet level agency that was not getting a clean audit opinion, and as you say, that was going on for 10 years. And the General Accountability Office, GAO, wanted HUD to get a clean audit opinion because, like I mentioned, they were the only cabinet level agency other than the DoD that was not getting a clean opinion. So one of the huge differences, and I spent a lot of time writing about this, and we will probably won't get into this in this webcast because it's a separate topic on its own. But that is one of the big differences between the private sector and government being the public sector. And there wasn't any real accountability. For 10 years of lack of audited financial statements, the auditors were giving recommendations. The General Accountability Office was giving recommendations. Congress was frustrated. Congress wanted about 260 financial reports of various sorts that were aged over 2 or 3 years. So everybody wanted this to be cleaned up, but there wasn't really any hammer to make it happen. And I didn't have any particular hammer. I just had a vision. And the biggest obstacle I had to come over was how to work within the walls of Washington and to figure out how do I get the resources to make this happen. So that's why I wrote the book, to talk about when you're bringing private sector experience into the executive branch, you don't necessarily control the resources, but you can make things happen. And we were very, very fortunate to get the resources we needed and put the plan in place and for the vision that we had and execute on it and turn this around in 3 years. And by the way, I should mention, most people didn't think we were going to be able to do this. Stakeholders on the outside that monitor HUD, especially in the mortgage world, that's FHA and Ginnie Mae. I talked to many executives and said, you're probably not going to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish. There were people inside the government that said the same thing to me. You're probably not going to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish, but do the best you can. and I took that as a challenge and said, game on. So
yeah. I don't want to ruin the ending for everyone on your book, but you do, in fact, transform HUD's financial systems. How did you develop your vision for transformation?
Yeah, another good question, and I spent a lot of time talking about this as well. When I was at Ernst and Young, as a coordinating partner signing audit opinions, you only can do that for 5 years. So every 5 years. And that's for independence reasons. I don't want you to get too cozy with your clients. So every 5 years, I was rotating on to another large global cloud client. And I adopted the same approach with HUD that I did in that process. And the first thing you want to evaluate on any entity is its people, its processes, and its technology. And then once you understand those 3 areas, the strengths and weaknesses, you can then begin to develop a vision for how to remediate. At HUD, all three of those areas needed homework. But primarily in the private sector, most utopia would be have perfect, great people, great systems, great processes, and great governance, and then the entity rolls along pretty well. Most companies will have two or three of those that are strong and one's weak, but they'll counterbalance each other to get to where you need to be on the fiscal side. So at HUD itself, we didn't have great governance, and we can talk about that. The people were great, but they weren't necessarily receiving the right training and the right processes. The government wasn't giving them the tools to succeed. So we had great people, but they needed different tools in order to execute. Processes needed to be improved. The IT systems were old, they were antiquated, they didn't communicate well together. So that was another area that we needed to focus on. So I took that approach to try to quickly evaluate all four of those areas, government, people, process, and technology. And then I executed on putting a different governance structure in place, and the secretary was so supportive of this. And in order to make this function and make this work, there's four things you absolutely need in a transition. One is leadership support, and the secretary wanted this cleaned up. He was very clear on that in my initial discussions with him. Congress wanted it cleared up. GAO wanted it cleared up, and OMB wanted it all remediated. So there was great leadership support, and we made it a strategic priority, as you know, and it was built it into all of our processes around the budgetary side. Then I spent a lot of time developing relationships, not only within HUD, but all of the external or the interagencies that I needed support from. That would be Treasury, OMB, Congress, and the General Accountability Office. And I needed support from them to make this happen. And that worked. I spent a lot of time. I realized the importance of that. And then we put a very detailed plan in place for the execution of improving processes. We put a very detailed plan in place to modernize the IT environment. And we put a detailed plan in place to build the governance within HUD itself, and maybe that's where I should have started. The first thing we did when we executed my plan, HUD itself, as you know, Evelyn, was a very siloed organization. There was 12 different programs that were monitoring close to 39 different grants. You had FHA, you had Ginnie Mae, you had the C-suite offices, and by and large, they were all working within their own little silos, and that doesn't work in the private sector. You can't have a company like McDonald's, not to pick on McDonald's because McDonald's had a brilliant governance structure, and I used them as a model in my mind as I went through this. But you can't have a company like McDonald's having their stores in 110 different countries operating in silos without any sort of government oversight and working towards one strategic mission and goal. And so I talked to the secretary about this, and he was very supportive of putting a governance structure in place, and we entitled it the Agency-Wide Integrity Task Force, and I talk a lot about this in the book. And what that group did was we took one political leader and one career leader within each of the programs and C-suite offices, FHA and Ginnie Mae, and we formed this group that met initially weekly to talk about the issues within the financial side and what it was needed to correct it and to remediate it. And this was not just a CFO activity. This was a agency-wide issue, and the programs didn't have great connectivity into the CFO office. So part of the Agency-Wide Integrity Task Force was to create that governance, to create that awareness, and to create what the programs had to do to help remediate. So the governance was so important, and the secretary was so supportive in making that group work well together, making it a strategic priority, and that kind of launched the effort to get to where we needed to be.
That's a great point, because you do talk about this task force a lot, And I think leadership matters, obviously coming from Dr. Carson, who was secretary at the time. But talk a little bit about how you got that buy-in from some of these other offices that maybe weren't used to having this type of relationship with the CFO's office, or perhaps didn't see the need, or, for whatever reason, weren't really engaged.
Evelyn, that's a phenomenal question. As a political appointee, and you know this, a lot of political appointees come in for different reasons. It could be a resume build. It could be they want to use it as a platform to run for office. They want to build a Washington monument somewhere. And we didn't talk about this, but my objective to go into work in the executive branch was to sort of give back. I was in my retirement years. I wanted to give back and keep my mind active and do meaningful work. So that's how I approached this. I had no political background. I knew nothing about government. So I had to create credibility with everyone. Who was this guy that's coming in from the private sector? So I had to create credibility with the program leaders, both political and in the career, and build credibility at the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, General Accountability Office, and the appropriators in Congress, the people that I needed to support from. Specifically as it related to HUD, I said to our team that the CFO is getting blamed for all these material weaknesses and the deficiencies, but my experience from the private sector is all these issues stem from out in the programs. And we didn't have great connectivity. We did not have a controllership function within the CFO that oversees the programs. That's a very common spot in the private sector. So I brought a position and a controller, and we then set up connectivity between the control and the programs. And we put a policy in place that the programs cannot change a process, an IT function that impacts the financial statements without the approval of the controller. So the CFO office knew what the programs were doing, so we can react to that from a control standpoint and a CFO standpoint. And then we also put in an agency-wide internal control task force and process, and we did training for each of the programs, and those, each of the programs had budgetary accountants, if you will. And we set up a very comprehensive program where there was education at each of the programs, FHA and GenMA, and with that controller, we created that connectivity. And that was really powerful. That was one of the key ingredients to this success, because all of a sudden the programs realized that if I change a process with a grantee that impacts the financial statement close process, that creates internal control weaknesses. Now that the CFO shop knows it, we can work around that and put the controls in place. So, and I didn't come in with a sense of this is how we're going to do this. I came in with a sense of educating people on what the issues are, with real transparency on all of the financial weaknesses, educating everyone on why it matters, which is really important, and then educating people on what the barriers to success were. And that became a theme of all the discussions at the agency-wide integrity task force, became a theme of discussions with each of the programs as we met with them individually, and just creating that awareness. I can't tell you how many times I heard from everyone, including Office of Management Budget and Congress, oh, wow, we have all these financial reporting that we're supposed to do, and HUD was in compliance with none of them, and I mean none of them. And so once we started to show progress in different areas, that helped with a lot of the credibility, and we showed pretty quick progress in a couple of simple areas, and then everyone started to understand why it was important, and then jumped on board to help remediate it. It ended up being a very successful agency-wide to get people to think differently than what they had in the past.
Some of the changes that you are describing are not just, I guess, tactical or a new hire. There's really a cultural difference that you're trying to instill. How did those changes come about?
Yeah, so that great question again. The agency-wide task force was set up to just do that, exact thing, to create the cultural awareness at the top of the agency, so it cascaded itself down. We needed people to think, the one HUD mentality. You probably saw that term quite often in various reports and discussions. And what's interesting about government when you're trying to change culture, very, very difficult in government compared to the private sector. Because at the private sector, you've got the board of directors, you got the C-suites or the CEO, CFO, and all of the leaders. That very seldom changes hands as often as the government does. I mean, in the government, you've got a complete new leadership change in the politicals every 4 to 8 years. And the politicals are the ones that set strategy and set culture. In the private sector, you could have a CEO leave, you got a couple board members leave, but you still have that embedded culture and strategy goals that you drive for. So what I thought was very important at HUD was the reason I set the agency-wide integrity task force up, so it included the political as well as the career leader at each of the programs, because I was hopeful we'd have 8 years, but I knew worst case we only had 4 years, right? So I wanted to make sure what we were trying to instill in the cultural change as it relates to the fiscal responsibility side of government sustains itself, in the IT modernization. Because every president comes in with a new management agenda, and in our administration, the focus was on improving IT modernization and fiscal responsibility, and that should be bipartisan, right? I mean, everyone should that shouldn't matter on whether you're an R or a D. So it was important for me that the leadership of the careers bought into what we were trying to accomplish, so it would sustain itself upon a change in administration.
So, through all of this, were there any things that surprised you or challenges that you just didn't expect?
Yes. A huge surprise on how hard it is to manage the resources you need to get things done. And I'm going to put that in two categories, three categories actually. One is you need resources and money and dollars. In the private sector, once you know you need something and you get the support, the dollars are there. The board may approve big acquisitions or whatever the expenditure is. It's pretty easy to get money. You also can control getting contracting resources pretty easy in the private sector. If we did this transformation with contracting support. If I was in the private sector, I could have had somebody on board the next day based on my private relationships or who I know I want to bring in. In government, you got to go through a federal acquisition FAR regulation, which is a 700-page document. And it takes anywhere from 6 to 8 months if you don't have pre-established relationships. So that slowed everything down. And then I think the unions had a stronghold that I wasn't used to seeing in the private sector. And trying to do things with people made it a little bit difficult because you had to go through a union process. So those three things I was probably generally aware of, but I didn't realize how complicated that would be. And trying to get money through OMB and Congress, we got where we needed to be. We can talk about that process in another session because that's unique in itself. But I also say, and I'm embarrassed to say this and almost ashamed, and I write about it, I was surprised at the quality of the people inside the executive branch, both at the political and the career. These are very, 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 very well-educated, very mission-driven people, and I was, you saw this too. People don't realize, and I wish the press would cover this. People don't realize how hard the career and the political appointees work at times of crisis in the United States. And I put this into three categories. Whenever there's a natural disaster, a flood, a hurricane, it is all hands on deck by various agencies, FEMA and HUD being one. And if the American people could see how hard they work to make sure lives are not disrupted and monies are getting to where they need to be through those natural disasters, I think they would appreciate how their dollars are spent a little more. The 32-day shutdown, that was another time where, I felt I was back in public accounting, working 14-hour days. And people worked very hard to make sure, the lives that we were impacted by that, and and in HUD's example, making sure money still got to those in need for housing was really important. And then the other one that was caught us all by surprise was COVID, right? I mean, the government at large, working within themselves and also the private sector, the COVID time was critical too. And people just don't realize how hard it is to, the money came, it was appropriated quickly by Congress. It got to the agencies quickly, and HUD as well. We got I think close to $14 or $15 billion, which is a substantial portion of our budget. And it took a lot of effort and time to get that money out. And it got to us quickly, and we had to get it out quickly. And again, that was all hands on deck to make sure that the relief money from COVID was getting to where it needs to be. So I wish the press would cover more about the positive side of the people and the processes that go into making sure the services that are performed by government are not disrupted during a crisis.
I tend to agree with you. I think that there are a lot of very effective people in the federal government, and I think this is one of the areas where leadership matters, because as we talked about, there are times where people who are very good at their job may not really understand how it's impacting other parts of the agency. And it's just maybe a matter of bringing those people together and figuring out these problems. And so that's why I've always really despised stovepiped organizations, because there is really no part of even the government that where you do one thing, it doesn't affect 5 or 6 other places. And I think it takes a good leader to recognize those areas and like you did, is make those changes. And often, unfortunately, sometimes there may not be the support of the leadership to do those things because they're focused on other aspects of the maybe programs or policies that they want to get done. But I think that this is just so important. An effective and efficient financial structure allows agencies to serve the American people better.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's all about, right?
One thing that I stressed, and it came very obvious to me inside of HUD, is the importance of the financial discipline and the controls helps the mission. And I made this argument with the Office of Management and Budget and Congress, because I went and asked for a big number for remediation, and they wouldn't give it to me, and because they thought the money I was asking for was pulling away from the people we serve in housing. And I said, no, you give this to me, I will guarantee you we'll get money out more effectively, more efficiently, without the fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's what good, sound financial processes do. And that's exactly what happened at HUD. I mean, through our remediation efforts, we found all kinds of dollars sitting in a bucket that wasn't being used because no one knew it was there, and it was close to $100 million. So we unlocked that, and that was a great example of getting money out to where we needed to be. But when you have that financial discipline and you have the IT modernization that connects you quicker and easier and more transparent with your grantees, you've got a better mission. And that became very clear. And I write about this because I think if people just had the perspective that you have to invest in good, sound financial systems and operations to make your mission more prosperous and more efficient and more effective, we proved that at HUD. And, I think that's really important for all agencies and government at large to understand that, Yeah, it's the way I think of it is, in the private sector, your number one goal is to make money, right? It's the number one goal, no matter what entity you are. Not for profit, you need money to do what you do. So if you're not making money and hitting your bottom line, you're going out of business. In government, it's all about spending money, right? It's a very different thing. But the financial infrastructure on both of those engines are exactly the same. And in fact, I actually would argue it's more important in the government because you're spending taxpayer monies. In the private sector, you're spending investors' money, which is a smaller pool. They're smart enough to know what's going on. They can drive those changes inside the financial infrastructure. In the government, taxpayers don't see it. They rely on the government to make sure those controls are in place. And I just think the financial engine of government is very, very important, and equally as important that it is in the private sector. I just don't think it gets the same level of attention and accountability.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And part of the reason we started this program, the Executive Branch for America, was to talk about these topics for people who are interested in joining the administration, the executive branch. And just from your perspective, because we could use, hundreds of Irv Dennis's back into the government, what do you say to people who are interested in joining but may not know how or what they should be doing? What's your best advice?
Yeah, my best advice is, and I talk a lot about this with college students and the corporations that I still have a small sphere of influence with, that I think bringing in private sector experience into the government is a great model. And folks in my situation that are retired looking for something to do, it's a great way to give back. You're giving back your experience, especially on the fiscal responsibility side, or whatever it may be in the executive branch. It was my favorite 4 years of my professional career. I mean, I loved my time at EY. I wouldn't do anything different, but this was just a special thing. And it's a great feeling working for the American people. So for the executives out there, I wish there was more of a platform for marketing by government. And we're trying to do that with the executive branches of America, as you say. And with the younger folks in the colleges and the students I talk to, I always tell them, if you have an opportunity to go in the executive branch sometime in your career for 3 or 4 years and learn how government operates, what the budgetary process is, how grants process flows, how laws and regs are made, what the regulatory environment is, all the intersections between the private sector and the government, you will be better at your career and a resume build. If I had this experience earlier in my career, I would have been a better audit partner and a better advisor to my clients. So, and conversely, if government had more private sector experience and understood financial excellence, the fiscal side of government would be better. So, I don't know how we make this happen from a program standpoint, but I would like to see some more networking of partnerships of private and government where they're exchanging people back and forth for a 2 or 3 year internship during their career. So I always tell younger folks that are graduating from college, think about it as a part of your career. There's no industry you can't learn inside of government, right? The housing touches, HUD touches all parts of housing, from the finance side with FHA, the equity side of cash flow with Ginnie Mae, and then all of the building and the housing on the HUD programs. And you could do that with any of the agencies. So there's no industry you can't learn inside of government. So, but again, colleges don't talk about it. Government doesn't promote itself accordingly. So if we could just tap into that thinking, I think it would be a worthy cause. And like I say, we're trying to do that with the Executive Branch of America. It's a great tool. It's a great product to educate people, and we'll get there someday. I'm confident.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you, Irv, because this has been a great conversation. I have 1,000 more questions for you. So I think would love to have you back on as a guest, not just as a host, to Heard on West Exec. And again, I would just encourage everyone to, if they're interested in this topic, it's a great read, Transforming a Federal Agency by Irv Dennis. And this has just been like a master's class in the executive branch. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Evelyn. This is my favorite topic to talk about these days, so anytime. Thank you.